All right, Shavuos, say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking all of our wonderful sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Avraham and Shaindy and Kelman for dedicating all the Sherman Drushos this month in honor of Yechiel's engagement to Ilana Falick and in memory of their parents, Jerome and Bernice Kelman, and Alexander and Friderica David Zechus. To thank Barak, Maia, Sandy, Hoffman, Dora, Lemus, and Melamed for dedicating the Shurim this month in memory of Reuven ben Emanuel, Zechus. To thank Ayal Sara Steinberg for dedicating the Shiurim this month in the zechus of refuah shelema for Shulamis bas Susha. The Daf Yomi Shiur for dedicating the Shiurim this month in the zechus of refuah shelema for Yehuda ben Michal. Our week of learning sponsors, Jeff and Karen Cohn, for dedicating the Shurim creation of the yard site of Jeff's mother, Elinor Cohn, Elka bas Binyomin. Louis Goldberg, for dedicating the week of learning as gratitude to Hashem for the engagement of his grandson, Eli Bogart, to Rivi Goloskov. Joseph and Ellen Miller, Iris and Ed Miller and family, Leslie and Adam Rosen and family, for dedicating the Shurim this week, L'zecher Nishmas, Yerachmiel ben Chaim, beloved uncle, brother-in-law, may his neshama have an aliyah, and the family a nechama. Both say we thank all of our sponsors for their incredible generosity, and with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Ayin Vav 76. We are picking up on Ayin Hey Amud Bey's 75b at Rava Amar, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, yesterday we began the Mishnah, continuing in the topic of Mumin, and specifically focused on the very interesting halachas concerning when women have the ability to go ahead and dissolve the marriage. So remember again, the Mishnah brought up two cases. Case number one is women were discovered va'oda ve'saviha, if she's still in her father's home. So the Mishnah said in that case, the burden of proof is upon the father to show that the woman developed after Erusin and were not, quote unquote, a pre-existing condition which would void the marriage. However, again, halacha l'maisa, if the woman were discovered after Nisuin, after she entered into the rishus of the Baal, then ultimately, again, the burden of proof is upon the husband to go ahead and show that those women were, in fact, a pre-existing condition. So the Gemara pointed out how, again, it appears that the Reisha and Seifa are authored by two different opinions. So now we'll say we're going weiter. Rava says, Reisha kan nimtzu v'kan hayu, Seifa nami kan nimtzu v'kan hayu. So Rava has an interesting position. Rava says when it comes to women, the way it works is like this. We assume that where they are found is where they developed. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if the women are found ultimately again in the father's home, we assume that that's where they were. And therefore, again, they were a pre-existing condition to Erusin. Therefore, it is upon the father to go ahead and show that no, the woman developed post-Erusin. If they go ahead and develop in the husband's rishus after Nisuin, we assume they developed after marriage. If at the end of the day the husband wants to prove that they were there before marriage, that burden of proof is upon him. So I'll say that's Rava's understanding of the two cases in the Mishnah. So Abai raises a kasha, Nichnas al rishus habal tzarach lahavi raya, sha'ad shelo tisares hayuba mumin elu. So again, Abai says, well, let's analyze this. Look at the seif of the Mishnah. So ultimately, if she enters into the rishus of the husband, i.e. Nisuin, right? So therefore, and then now the husband discovers the mumin. Ultimately, the burden of proof is upon the husband to go ahead and prove that the woman existed ad shalotis ares, before Erusin. So the Gemara says, ad shalotis ares hayiba mumin elu, vaya mikcho mekach tos. So again, this is not exact quotation from the Mishnah, but a basic quotation from the Mishnah, that if the husband discovers the woman after Nisuin, the burden of proof is upon him to show that the woman existed prior to Erusin, and therefore this entire thing was a mekachtos. To which the Gemara says, "V'haya mekachtos, ad shlotis ares in, mishitis ares lo." Now, interesting. Again, he has to go ahead and prove that these women were there before Erusin. But if he's able to prove that they were there from Erusin, apparently that's not enough. But why not? V'amai lema kandim suvekan hayu. Remember, during Erusin, she's living in her father's home. According to what Rabbi just said, wherever the woman is discovered, he doesn't mean physically on her, wherever home in which the mum is discovered, we assume that's where the mum has been. If that's the case, if he could prove that the mum existed during Erisin she was living in her father's home, let's assume that what? It's been there ever since she's been living in her father's home. How long has she been living in her father's home? Prior to Erisin as well. If that's the case, then we should say that this mum was a pre-existing condition prior to Erisin, and as such, he can claim mekach tos. So again, va'amai, lema kan nimtzu v'kan hayu, according to what Rava said, let's say here is where the mum is found, and here is where we assume that the mum has been the entire time. Amar le mishin is arsa. Ultimately, again, remember, so the Gemara says, we're talking about a situation where the mum is only discovered after Erisin. Mishum de'ika lamemar chazaka, ein adam sho sebekos ela imkin botko. Well, it's an interesting expression. We assume a person does not go ahead and drink from a cup unless, of course, he first examines the cup. In other words, that we assume that he would not have engaged in Erisin had he not gone ahead and made sure that she was free from mumin. To which the Gemara says, therefore, halacha l'maisa, this is only being discovered after Erisin, right? So only being discovered after Erisin. And again, there's another chazaka. The chazaka is that a man does his due diligence, so to speak, before going and engaging in Erisin. To which the Gemara says, v'hayra v'nefayisu. And therefore, we have to assume that, again, he saw the mum and ultimately became reconciled to it, accepted it. Ihachi, if that's the case, ad shalotis ares nami. It says ad shalotis ares nami. If that's the case, then halacha l'maisa, even if the mum was discovered before Erisin, why don't we say chazaka, that a person doesn't do Erisin with a woman, ultimately again, until he knows that she's mum free. Person doesn't drink from the glass up until before he inspects it. Ela aminon chazaka ein adam mefayes bemumin. Rather, I will say again, we have another chazaka. The other chazaka is that a person doesn't become reconciled to mumin. I will say it's an interesting chazaka. This chazaka says that men sometimes can be a little bit shallow, meaning that what? That the default assumption is that if there's a significant mum, the husband is not going to accept it. Hachanami chazaka ein adam mefayes bemumin. To which the Gemara says, Ella mishen is arsa. Rather, you have to say like this. The case that we're dealing with is a case ultimately, again, where the mum is being discovered after Erisin. Mishum di'ika tarti chazaka. Now, I will say, in this case, there are two chazakas. What are the two chazakas? Number one, hamid haguf al chaskaso. Now, I will say, this is an interesting chazaka. Hamid guf al chaskaso means what? The body has a chazaka. Now, I will say, this is fascinating. What's the chazaka of the body? The chazaka of the body is that it's mum free. That's interesting. That's the chazaka, that it's mum free. Again, we're going to distinguish, by the way, say, between different type of mumin, where you can apply this chazaka, you can't apply this chazaka. Elas, the Gemara says, Hemed kufal cheskaso, v'chazaka ein adam sho sebakos, ela imkein botko. And I will say, there's another chazaka. What's the second chazaka? The second chazaka, ultimately, again, is that a man, doesn't engage in Erisin until he knows that the woman is mum-free. Person doesn't drink from a glass until he first inspects it. V'hara'a v'nefayesu. And therefore, again, I will say, if there is a mum that is discovered during Erisin, the default assumption is that what? He knew about it and he accepted it. So I will say, it's very interesting. So now what we're saying is like this. Let's take a step back. So halacha l'maisa, if at the end of the day, the mum is discovered after Erisin, the Gemara wants to suggest that there are two chazakas at play. Number one, and here I want to point out, one chazaka is on her, one chazaka is on him. The chazaka on her is, there's a cheskas aguf, right? A bodily chazaka. What's the bodily chazaka? That a person doesn't have a mum. That's the bodily chazaka. Then, there's a chazaka on him, that a man only drinks from a glass if he first inspects it. He must have, quote unquote, inspected. And ultimately, again, he did Erisin anyway, which tells us that what? Even if there was a mum, what must have happened over here? He must have accepted it. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, the Gemara says, my amrit, chazaka ein adam mefayes bemumin. But one second, here's the other problem. You have a counter chazaka. What's the counter chazaka? The counter chazaka is, people do not normally accept mumin. Which I will say is such a profound yesod. Ein adam mefayes mumin means people do not normally reconcile themselves with mumin. Here's a fascinating about this, Rabbi say. What kind of mumin, what kind of blemishes, what kind of imperfections don't people reconcile themselves with? It's fascinating. Someone else's mum. It's really fascinating. My own mumin, right? My own blemishes, I'm very good to reconcile. I'm good, right? I'm good. I can easily accept those. The mumin of others are the ones that ultimately I cannot become reconciled with. So we'll say, so this is an opposing chazaka. So my amrit chazaka in adam efais b'mumin, have amid beis, sorry, wishful thinking, ayin vav amid aleph, 76a, havichada b'makom tarti. So I will say, so essentially what I have over here is one chazaka against two. One chazaka of ein adam efais b'mumin, that a person does not become reconciled with a mum, which means that would tell us that if there was a mum, the husband would be a mekach taos, right? Versus the other two chazakas. What are the other two chazakas? Number one, hemad aguf al cheskaso, a cheskas aguf, right? That the body doesn't have a mum, and ultimately chazaka number two, ein adam shose bekos ela imkin botgo. Person only drinks from a cup if he first goes ahead and inspects it. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Chadamakom tarti v'chadamakom tarti lo amrinan. Fine, and therefore also when we have a clash of two chazakas against one, obviously the two chazakas are going to win. Second line down, ayin vav amud aleph. So ad shalotis ares. So ultimately I will say, halacha l'maisa, if the mum is discovered prior to erusin, sahamed haguf al cheskaso lo ika l'meimar. So we'll say, so obviously, so let's analyze this. If the mum is discovered before erusin, then of course I lose the chazaka of ha'emed guf al cheskasa. Remember again, what's the chazaka of ha'emed guf al cheskasa? That there was no mum. So obviously, if the mum was discovered, if you could prove that the mum pre-existed erusin, then you cannot go ahead and utilize that chazaka. So ha'emed guf al cheskasa lo ika lemeimar. So my ika, if I take that one away, what do I have? My ika, chazaka, the only thing I have, Rabbi say, therefore, is what? That a person only drinks from a cup, ultimately, again, if he first inspects it. So the Gemara says, and therefore, again, Rabbi say, it must be that halacha l'maisa, he saw the mum, and he became reconciled to it. So the Gemara says, Adarabba, chazaka in adam efayis b'mumin, v'ha'amid mamon al cheskaso. Here's the problem we'll say. Now I have one chazaka against another chazaka. I have one chazaka that says that's what? So ultimately, again, a person doesn't drink from a glass unless he first inspects it, which means that if we could prove that the mum pre-existed erusin, and he did erusin anyway, it must mean that what? He accepted the mum, and therefore, again, the erusin is good. But I have another chazaka. What's the other chazaka? Ein adam efayis b'mumin. That a person ultimately does not become reconciled to a mum. And therefore, I will say that chazaka says that it must be that he didn't know about it. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, the kiddushin would not be good. So that's the clash over there. Then I will say, what happens ultimately again when you have a clash of chazakas? So like any other time you have a clash of anything in halacha, status quo. So I will say, in this case, status quo means Hamad Maman al Cheskaso, which ultimately means the ksuva money would remain with the husband. Okay, so we'll say, so this is Rava's approach. So we'll say, so just to kind of encapsulate it, so Rava's idea in the Mishnah is like this. Wherever the mum is discovered, that's where we assume it came about. So therefore, again, case number one in the Mishnah is mum is discovered after erusin. So right. So in other words, and where is the girl living? In her father's home. So therefore, I will say, because the mum is discovered in her father's home, what do we assume? That mum has always been there in her father's home. Therefore, again, the Gemara says it is the burden of proof is upon the father to prove that the mum developed post erusin and nistapcha sadehu. And now again, it's the husband's field, so to speak, that has become flooded. That's so the burden of proof. So the default over here is the mum pre-existed, mekach tos, no marriage, no ksuva. You want to prove that's not the case? Burden of proof is upon the father. Similarly, what happens if halacha l'maisa, the mum is discovered where? Post nisuin, she's living with her husband. We assume where the mum is discovered, that's where it developed. So we assume the default is, where did this mum develop? Where did it develop? In the husband's home. Therefore, the burden of proof is going to be upon the husband to prove that what? The mum was a pre-existing condition prior to Erison. Beautiful. Not beautiful, but good. Rav Ashi says, Reisha is actually very interesting. Rav Ashi says, here's the difference. In the Reisha case, you're supposed to remember again, the Reisha is, the mum is discovered after Erison, while Rachel, we'll call her Rachel and Reuven, while Rachel is living in her father's home. So in that case, the Mishnah said the burden of proof. Again, the lashon of the Mishnah is ha'av tzarich lahavi raya shemishinis arsa hayu bamumin halalu. So the burden of proof is upon the father. So look what Rava says. So I'm sorry, look Rav Ashi Amar Reisha manali abba biadecha. So we'll say it's fascinating. The Reisha case is really about to say who's making the claim. Who's making the claim here, right? The claim over here is really a monetary claim being made by the father. Manali abba biadecha. The seifa is manali biadecha. The seifa case, where the mum is discovered in the husband's home, is a case of where the wife herself is making the monetary claim. Now, where is this distinction? Look at Rashi. This is fascinating. Rav Ashi Amar, let's in the short lines of Rashi, 3 lines in. Rav Ashi Amar, Mahader nami le'ukma kula ki Rabbi Gamliel, techazaka de gufa adifa. So remember again, I say we began yesterday's daf, we began Amud Beis of yesterday, trying to align the Mishnah with the positions of Rabbi Gamliel versus Rabbi Yoshua. Namely, again, how much does her chezkas haguf play a role in all of this? So listen to this. So Rav Ashi wants to suggest according to Rashi, Rav Ashi is suggesting that the entire Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Gamliel, that her chezkas haguf, right? The assumption that she has an intact chezkas haguf is what drives all this. Now watch this. Reisha lahachi lo mahanya chazaka de gufa, lefi she'en hatayna shela, ela shel aviha, shekesuvos erisin li av, v'havile mana la avicha biadecha, the gabe av lo aminan beguf shela tetene chazaka. So we'll say, watch this. This is incredible. Rav Ashi says like this. In reality, I will say, what's the dominant chazaka over here? It's really fascinating. What's the dominant chazaka? Chezkas haguf. What's the chezkas haguf? Right? What's the chezkas haguf that a human being has? No mum. That's the chezkas haguf. So therefore, I will say like this. So therefore, let's play this out. So Reuven does Erisin with Rachel. Right, they're in. So now Rachel's living in her father's home. A mum is discovered. So I will say, so again, this should kind of be kind of black and white. We should assume, when did the mum develop? Right now. Right now means what? After Erisin. Well, how can you assume that? Because she has a chezkas haguf. And what's the chezkas haguf? That Allah l'maisa, she's without mum. She's mum free. That's the chezkas haguf. So listen to this. Here's the difference. In the Reisha, I will say, during Erisin, when the husband is claiming dissolution of the marriage and father is claiming that marriage should really be valid, and if you want to get divorced, give her a get, that's fine, that's your business. I will say, who collects the ksuva during Erisin? Who collects the ksuva? The father. So watch this. Essentially, the Reisha of the Mishnah is a case of where the father is claiming that if Reuven wants to get out of this marriage, the ksuva is owed to him. Because it's the father making the monetary claim, the father cannot support his claim with her chezkas haguf. Isn't this incredible? In other words, we'll say, so in other words, chezkas haguf works when the person claiming chezkas haguf is also what? The person making the claim. But if the person making the claim is someone other than the one who has the chezkas haguf, you can't claim someone else's chezkas haguf to support your monetary claim. Such a fascinating idea. So therefore, because the Reisha is the father's monetary claim, he can't use his daughter's chezkas haguf to support that claim. Absolutely incredible. The seifa, manali biadecha. And I both say conversely, the second part of the Mishnah, where again the mum is discovered when? After Nisuin, so now who's going to collect the ksuva in the event of divorce? Who's going to collect it? She is going to, Rachel's going to. In that case, she can utilize her own chezkas haguf. Pretty incredible. So the Gemara says, Eisvi Rav Achabred Rav Avi Rav Ashi, Mod Rabbi Meir Bemumin, Haru'uyin Lavo Imami Beisavia, Sha'al Ha'av Lahavi Raya. Listen to this, Rabbi said. Rabbi Meir agrees that in the case of a mum, now both is interesting lashon, Haru'uyin Lavo Ima Mi Beisaviha. Everyone agrees with a mum that we know Ru'uyin means that are fit to come with her from her father's home. What does that mean? The type of mum, Rabbi say, that we assume was a pre-existing condition. right? Rabbi Meir agrees that with the type of mum that is a pre-existing condition, that the burden of proof is upon the father to prove that the mum existed prior to this. In other words, I will say what we're going to see in just a moment is like this. Not every mum is the same. So if she is a type of mum that it really looks like it was there before Erisin, in that case, the burden of proof is upon the father to prove that it developed after Erisin. I'll just point out what a profound yisod. If you think about Rabbi saying, everyone has mumin haruyin lavo mi beis aviyah. Everyone has mumin that come from a parent's home. Right? Rabbi saying, no parents are perfect. No parents are perfect, and therefore, by definition, there are always missteps in raising children. So every child comes with a particular set of mumin from their parents' home. The difference is you can't allow those mumin to sideline you. A person has to find the way to grow past those mumin as well. So the Gemara says, "Va'amai," but why is that? According to what we just said, "Mana li biyadechahu." So we'll say again, if that's the case, but still, halacha l'maisa, if this is being claimed after nisuin, if this is being claimed ultimately again after marriage, then it's a claim that she is making herself. So mana li biyadecha, hachamayaskinan is very interesting. Be a siras. I will say, what kind of mum are we talking about? Like where she has an extra finger. See, I will say, if she has an extra finger, so bepashtos, that didn't just like pop up, right? In other words, that's been there. So that's a raya. That's what we call mumin haruyin lavo imami beis aviha. So we'll say a type of mum that we think seems pretty clear that that was a pre-existing condition. The Gemara says, 1 second, my raya maisi. We'll say, so the truth is like, if it's an extra finger, so that seems to be an open and shut case. That would be a case of a pre-existing mum, which would then potentially be grounds for mekachtos. To which the Gemara says, no, what's the counterclaim? My raya maisi, raya dira v'nefayesu. No, Rabbi say ultimately again the raya is that what? That he saw it. Right? That's the raya. The raya is that's a pretty visible mum, right? And ultimately again it's going to be pretty hard to hide, and therefore he must have seen it and ultimately become reconciled with it. Good. So I'll say, so I just want to point out, bottom line, we're not finished yet, but here's what we have. The Mishnah just gives me a very simple framework, and that's why Rava's articulation seems to be the most straightforward. Again, Reuven and Rachel get married. After Erisin, a mum is discovered. If mum is discovered in father's home, then what? Obligation is upon the father to prove that halacha l'maisa what? That halacha l'maisa, the mum developed post-Erisin and was not a pre-existing condition. If mum is discovered in husband's home after nisuin, then burden of proof is upon the husband to prove that it existed prior to Erisin, and it is a mekach taos. That's the machlokes. Did I say that right by the father? Right. Burden of proof is upon if mum is discovered in the father's home, burden of proof is upon the father to prove that's what? It developed post Erisin, and this is essentially the husband's problem. Husband discovers it in his home. Burden of proof is upon the husband to show that it was a pre-existing condition prior to Erisin, and it's a mekach taos. Incredible. Supposed to listen to this. Gemara Yehuda Shmuel. Hamachlif para b'chamar. I will say this is such a fascinating case. So we'll say, here we go. Hamachlif para b'chamar. So I will say this is a classic transaction. Rashi says over here, here's what's happening. Right? Reuven and Shimon. Reuven owns the par. Shimon owns a chamor. Right? Reuven owns a cow. Shimon owns a donkey. They want to make a swap. So we'll say, take a look at Rashi this moment. Mashach, actually not yet. So we'll say, so we're going to see there is the ability to go ahead and engage in a type of transaction where two people are exchanging two items. The moment that one of the parties does mashicha, right, takes physical possession of the item, the other party acquires their item, even if the item is not there, not present. So for example, right, Reuven and Shimon, Reuven owns a par, Shimon owns a chamar, right? Reuven owns a cow, Shimon owns an ox. So Reuven is going to swap, chamar, donkey, right? So Reuven is going to give his cow to Shimon, and Shimon is going to give his donkey to Reuven. So the moment that Reuven, let's say, does mashicha, goes ahead and pulls the donkey, so Shimon acquires the cow, even if the cow is not there. It's ta'alocha. So watch this case. Well, so you're going to see what this has to do in our mission in just a moment. So I'm going to be Hudam Shmuel, Hamachlif para b'chamar. Two parties are exchanging a cow for a donkey. Umashach balachamar es hapara. And I will say the owner of the donkey does mashicha on the para, right? So what happens? The donkey's not there. The donkey's not present, right? So what happens? The owner of the donkey, though, does mashicha on the par, right? He takes the reins of the cow, he pulls it, does mashicha. Now the par is his. So we'll say, now watch this. Here's the problem, right? So now we'll say, in that moment, when the balachamar, the owner of the donkey, does mashicha on the cow, so what happens? Transactionally, what happens? So now the owner of the donkey becomes the proud owner of the cow, and the owner of the cow becomes the proud owner of the donkey. Donkey's not there. Here's the problem. By the time the owner of the cow, who is now the brand new owner of the donkey, comes to see his donkey, what happens? The donkey's dead. Barak dynamics, right? The donkey's dead. Right? Donkey's dead. Shabbos says, now what's the shaila? Shabbos says, here's the shaila. When did the donkey die? See, did the donkey die prior to the mashicha of the par? In which case the entire transaction is void, because again, the donkey was dead at the time of the transaction. Or did the donkey die after the owner of the donkey did mashicha on the par, on the cow? In which case, unfortunately, again, the owner of the cow, who's now the new owner of the donkey, lost out. To which the Gemara says, Al bala chomer lahavi raya sheyachamora kayim b'shas mashicha aspara. Very interesting. I will say, who does the burden of proof rest upon? The burden of proof rests upon the owner of the donkey to show that his donkey was alive at the time of the transaction. That's the halacha. Burden of proof is upon him. Rashi says over here, all right, fine. So good. Burden of proof is upon him. We'll say a beautiful piece to tell you about this Gemara in just a moment, but let's go back to Vitana Tuna, Kala. So we'll say, and this is the same halacha as we see by the Kala. Okay, for interesting comparison of cases, right? So we'll say, so what's the comparison over here? So Gemara says, hey Kala, which kala we were comparing to the donkey, right? In other words, which kala case? And I was going to say, we're talking about our Mishnah. So which kala case is compared to the donkey? Say, ilema amud beis, ilema kala beis aviha. So I'll say, if you want to say that it's ultimately the reisha, maybe it's the reisha. It's talking about the case of the kala, where the mum is discovered in her father's home. So we'll say, so me, how can you compare the cases? Hasam, maisi av raya umapik. So we'll say the reisha, what's going to happen? In the reisha's case, if the father proves that what? If the father proves that ultimately the mum developed post-erison, if the father is able to prove that, then what? Then halacha l'maisa, he's able to extract the ksuva from the husband. Hacha maisi bal hachama raya umokim. Here I will say, what's the goal? The bal hachamer has to prove that his donkey was live at the transaction in order for him to what? To keep what? To keep the cow. So I'll say, it's two different transactions. Rabbi Abi, you're right. Kala beis chameha. We're talking about the case, we'll say the second case of the Mishnah, that we call the kala in her father-in-law's home, which is the equivalent of talking about what? The kala after nisuin in her husband's home. Vakati lo dami. Still, those cases are not comparable. Why? Hasam bal maisiraya umar lelechazake da'av. So we'll say there, if the husband brings a raya, ultimately, again, he erodes the chazak of the father. Hacha balachamer maisi raya. Here, the owner of the donkey brings a raya. Umokim chazake biyadei. And ultimately, again, he establishes the chazaka, i.e., that he is the proper owner of the cow. Aram Nacham Yitzchak, you're right. Kala beis aviha. So I'll say, we're just trying to figure out, all the Gemara just said was, this case of where we say that we go back, right? So again, the burden of proof is upon the owner of the donkey to prove that his donkey was alive at the time of the transaction. And the Gemara says this is just like the case of the kala. We're just trying to figure out what case of kala are you comparing it to. So here we go. Amar Nachman bar Yitzchak, kala bebeis aviha u'lekidushin. Oh, both say, what are we talking about? Quite fascinating. But also, what we mean to go ahead and compare it to is the case of the kala in her father's home. And I will say specifically for who gets to keep the kesef kiddushin. So also, I want to point out something very interesting. Up until now, the discussion about the mum, right? So let's go back to our Mishnah. The discussion about the mum was the mum discovered in the father's home, was the mum discovered in the husband's home. the conversation financially has been focused on what? The ksuva. There's another financial element over here, which is what Rabbi saying, kesef kiddushin. Kesef kiddushin. Who gets to keep the kesef kiddushin? So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman Yitzchok says, the case of the donkey, the same way that halacha l'maisa, the burden of proof is upon the owner of the donkey to go ahead and prove that his donkey was alive at the time of the transaction, in order to enable him to go ahead and what? Keep the cow. So too, the burden of proof is upon the father. When the mum is discovered in the father's home post-Erusin, the burden of proof is upon the father to prove that what? That the mum developed post-Erusin in order for the father to be able to keep kesef kiddushin. Oh, that's a comparison. So the Gemara says, "V'lo teima liba daman damar kiddushin lav l'tibur nitnu." So we'll say this is not only true. We'll say we're going to see there's a fascinating machlokes about, in general, what is the status of kesef kiddushin, right? They will say, when a man gives a woman kesef kiddushin, do we assume that he allows her to keep that kesef kiddushin no matter what happens? I will say, by the way, this is very shaykh. It's not really the same thing, but you know where sometimes this comes up? In cases of broken engagement, right? Who gets to keep the ring? Who gets to keep the ring? Now, the truth is, it's not really a fair comparison, because the truth is, engagement is not a halachic process and has zero halachic validity. But again, it's still for our frame of reference. So again, kesef, what we call, so the Gemara says, v'lo tema, this is not only a question of liba demand damar kiddushin lav l'tibur nitnu. So we'll say that lashon of kiddushin lav l'tibur nitnu means that there's an opinion that says, kesef kiddushin is not money that's automatically kept by the recipient, even if the marriage does not progress. We'll say, even if you hold that in general, kesef kiddushin is given and it's not expected back, hanimili kiddushay vadai. That's only true. We'll say, so in other words, this is actually very interesting. Says the machlokes. Take a quick look at Rashi. Aliba demand damar kiddushin lav l'tibur nitnu. Say it's about 6 lines up from before Rashi gets wide. Rashi says, stam kiddushin lav l'tibur nitnu she'im meis hachosan hakidushin chosrin. So we'll say, so this is a machlokes. When a man gives a woman kesef kiddushin, so do we say that his kavanah is like this? Listen, I'm giving you this. If we get married, obviously it's yours. And even if we don't get married, I don't expect it back. So that's a machlokes, kiddushin l'tivuin nivnu or lav l'tivuin nivnu. Does a husband kind of give it as an irrevocable, I don't want to call it a gift, but an irrevocable transfer? Or no, it's only given with the intention to get married. So also listen to this. This is fascinating. Even according to the opinion that says kiddushin l'tibur nitnu, which means that when a man gives a woman kesef kiddushin or gives her father kesef kiddushin, even if they don't get married, he doesn't expect it back. When is that so? Hani mili kiddushay vadai. I will say that's only when there is a definitive kiddushin. Aval kiddushay tos. I will say if it's a case of kiddushin tos, for example, like what? Where a mum is discovered, I maisi raya in, I lo. If ultimately, again, then I will say, in a kiddushay tos, everyone would agree that if there is a tos, the husband is going to want his kiddushin back. So I will say, so therefore the Gemara suggesting is like this. When the Gemara said that the case of machlif shar b'chamar is just like the case of kala, what that means is like this. Just like the owner of the chamar had the burden of proof to show that his chamar was alive at the time of the transaction, so too, if a woman is discovered on the girl when she's in her father's home, the burden of proof is upon the father to prove that the mum developed post-Erusin in order to allow him to what? To keep the kesef kiddushin. Because even if you hold that normally kesef kiddushin is given in an irrevocable fashion, that's only in the case of kiddushay vadai. But in the case of potential kiddushay tos, the husband would want his kesef kiddushin back. Incredible, absolutely incredible. So let's go weiter. Meisvei. I just have to tell you very, very quickly on the case of machlif. All right, let me just do a couple more lines. So let's say, let me tell you this right now. Let's listen to this. On this case of hamachlif shar b'chamar, so we'll say the great tzaddik Rav Shmelk of Nikolsburg says something absolutely amazing. He says there is a musar in this case of hamachlif shar b'chamar. Para b'chamar, someone is exchanging a cow, a para, for a chamar. Listen to what the Rebbe says. Get ready for this. Hine haneshama karuya para. The neshama, the soul, is called a para. Why is the soul called a para? Al shem shepara v'raba b'mitzvos. Because they will say para is like period of arivia, right? Procreation. Because the soul procreates in mitzvahs. The soul does a lot of mitzvahs, para of mitzvahs. So we'll say, but what happens in life? What happens in life? What happens so often in life is va'adam hamachlif para b'chamar. We'll say, what does a person end up doing in life? He exchanges the para, the neshama, which is ready to procreate in mitzvahs, for what? For the chamar. We'll say, what's the chamar? Chumra, right? Not chumra, but chumrius, right? Physicality. He says, shayalo lasok be'esek haneshama, vu'asak be'esek hachomer, dahainu be'esek haguf. They will say, you hear what's happening over here in the Gemara? We just thought this was a simple transactional case. Meanwhile, it's life unfolding on Daf Ayin Vav in Kesuvos. Life is all about a person has a para. I have a neshama. I have a beautiful neshama. What does my neshama want? My neshama wants ruchnius. My neshama wants spiritual accomplishment. My neshama wants closeness and devekos b'Hashem. That's what my neshama wants. And what do I end up doing? Hamachlif para b'chamar. I go and I exchange the neshama. And what do I exchange the neshama for? For chomer, for physicality. For the guf. And I will say, so what happens? Umashach bal hachamar as hapara. So I will say, so what happens? So sometimes at the end of the day, I recognize the error of my ways. So what do I want to do? I want to go ahead and exchange mashach bal hachamar as hapara. I want to go back, even though now I exchanged my para for a chamar. But now I will say, what do I want to do? I want to go back and reclaim my para. Sometimes what happens? Shalo hispik bala para limshoch has a chamar. So we'll say, so again, ultimately again, the Rebbe goes on. I'm going to leave it here. We'll say, but just understand the power of that phrase. There's sometimes like what happens. I will say, sometimes we have eternity at our fingertips and we exchange it for something else. I have a para in my hands. I have a neshama, and sometimes so foolishly, not even realizing what it is that I'm doing. Hamachlif para b'chamar. I give up eternity. I give up a neshama. I give up spiritual growth for what? For a chamar, for a donkey, for physicality, for fleeting enjoyment, for temporal pleasure. And I will say, but the beautiful part is that which you exchange. If I'm machlif para b'chamar, I could also go ahead and what? Reclaim my para as well. Such says Rav Shmuel of Nikolsburg. Again, I will say, let's go weiter. We have a few more minutes. Meisvei, so where is the kasha? Machat shouldn't taste but beis hakosos. I will say now, interesting case. At first glance, has nothing to do with our sugya. We're going to say how we connect it back. I will say this is a case of trefus. Remember, Kesuvos shas cutting. So what happens? I shecht an animal. I open up the animal, and what do I find? I find a needle in the beis hakosos. Beis hakosos is one of the 4 stomachs of a cow. I find a needle in there. Now, I remember again, what's the shaila now? Is the animal a treifa? So mitzad echad kshera. If the needle only pierced one side, the animal is kosher. Mishnit stadin. If ultimately again the needle pierced through the entire wall of the stomach, then ultimately treifa. Nimtzala korat dam. If there's a little bit of blood found on the needle, biadua shulifnei shchita. I know that ultimately the piercing took place before shchita. Lo nimtzala korat dam. If there's no blood on the needle, then what? Biadua shehu la'achar shchita. Then ultimately I know that it occurred after shchita. Huglad piyamaka. If ultimately again the piercing scabbed over, biadua sheshlosh yomim kodem shchita. Then I know that it occurred at least 3 days before shchita. Lo huglad piyamaka. If it did not scab over, then hamotzi mechavera alav haraya. Ultimately, again, then what? Then the burden of proof is upon the extractor. The yav tabach dami ba'ilasuye raya umapik. So we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up, however, again, if halacha lamaisa, if the butcher already paid, then ultimately, again, it is upon the butcher to go ahead and bring a raya. So we'll say again, we're going to stop here for that. I'm leaving you in the middle of the case. We'll pick up with this case in Mir Hashem tomorrow and loop it back ultimately to the case of the Kala. We'll say shkoyach.